They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but Sarah didn't want revenge. She wanted justice. When Richard handed her the divorce papers, he laughed, telling his lawyers she was worthless without his last name. He took the penthouse, the stocks, and the pride, leaving her with a crumbling house and a broken heart. He thought he had erased her. But he forgot one thing. Before she was his wife, she was someone else entirely. And when he walked into the biggest merger of his life 3 years later, he didn't just lose a deal. He lost his breath. Because the name on the contract that froze the entire room, it wasn't a stranger's. It was hers. The air in the conference room on the 44th floor of the One World Trade Center was so cold it felt sterile, stripped of any warmth or humanity. It smelled of lemon polish and expensive leather, the scent of money. Outside, the grey New York skyline was weeping rain against the floor-to-ceiling glass. But inside, Richard Sterling was beaming. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Tom Ford suit, a subtle check of the Rolex Daytona on his wrist. He looked at the woman sitting across the sprawling mahogany table. Sarah. She looked small. That was the first thing Richard thought. After 12 years of marriage, she looked incredibly small. She was wearing a beige cardigan that had seen better days and no jewelry, her hands folded quietly in her lap. She looked like a substitute teacher waiting for a reprimand, not the wife of one of Wall Street's most aggressive hedge fund managers. "Let's get this over with, Sarah," Richard said, his voice smooth, lacking even a tremor of regret. "I have a reservation at Le Bernardin at 7. Sarah didn't look up. Her eyes were fixed on the stack of documents in front of her. "The house in the Hamptons?" she asked softly. Richard let out a short, sharp laugh. He glanced at his lawyer, Arthur Pendleton, a man with a shark's grin and a forehead that shone under the fluorescent lights. "The Hamptons house is a marital asset, acquired through my bonuses, Sarah," Richard said, leaning forward. "As per the prenuptial agreement, which you signed, if you recall, you are entitled to the assets you brought into the marriage, which, if my memory serves, was a Honda Civic and a student loan debt." "I supported you while you finished law school, Richard," Sarah said. Her voice wasn't angry, it was tired. "I worked double shifts at the diner. I paid for your bar exam fees." "And I paid for your lifestyle for the last decade," Richard countered, his tone hardening. "The galas, the charity luncheons, the clothes you stopped wearing because you preferred comfort. We're even." Arthur, the lawyer, slid a pen across the table. It was a Mont Blanc, heavy and black. "Ms. Sterling, or, I suppose, Miss Bennett, soon. The settlement is actually quite generous considering the circumstances. Richard is offering you the cottage in upstate, the one near Woodstock." Sarah finally looked up. Her eyes were a piercing, unexpected shade of green. "The cottage? It has structural damage, Arthur. The roof leaks. It's uninhabitable in winter." "It has charm," Richard said, checking his watch again. "And it's fully paid off. Fix it up. Sell it. I don't care. It's yours. That and a lump sum of $50,000 to help you get situated." 50,000. It was what Richard spent on a weekend golf trip to Augusta. "And if I refuse to sign?" Sarah asked. Richard sighed, the sound of a man dealing with a petulant child. "Then we go to court, and I will spend every dime I have, which is a lot, Sarah, to ensure that the legal fees bury you. You will walk away with nothing. No cottage, no 50 grand, just the clothes on your back. Do the math. You've always been decent at arithmetic." He was mocking her. He was referencing the fact that she used to do his accounting in the early days, back when they operated out of a one-bedroom apartment in Queens, back when he called her his secret weapon. Sarah looked at the papers. The divorce decree. Sterling v. Sterling. She thought about Amelia. Amelia was 24, an intern at Richard's firm, with legs that went on for days and a laugh that sounded like champagne bubbles. Richard hadn't even been subtle about it. He had wanted Sarah to find out. He wanted to upgrade his life, and Sarah, with her quiet books, her gardening, and her refusal to get Botox, was a relic of his past. She picked up the pen. The weight of it felt cold in her hand. "You really think this is it, Richard?" she whispered. "You think you can just discard people like receipts?" "I'm not discarding you," Richard said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "I'm liberating you. You never fit in this world, Sarah. You were always plain. Now you can go back to being plain in peace." He threw a look at Arthur. "Wrap this up." Sarah didn't shake. She didn't cry. She simply signed her name, Sarah Bennett. She pushed the papers back. "Keep the pen," Richard said, walking toward the door without looking back. "Consider it a parting gift." As the heavy glass door clicked shut behind him, Sarah remained seated. The silence returned to the room. Arthur, the lawyer, gathered the files, looking at her with a mix of pity and impatience. "I'll have the deed to the Woodstock property mailed to you," Arthur mumbled. "You should probably find a hotel for tonight. Richard wants the keys to the penthouse by 5 p.m. Sarah stood up. She smoothed down her beige cardigan. For a second, the plain housewife demeanor flickered, replaced by something rigid, something made of steel. She looked at the view of the city, a city built by men like Richard. "Don't worry about the deed, Arthur," she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its trembling softness. "Send it to my P.O. box and tell Richard to enjoy his dinner. I hear the sea urchin at Le Bernardin is particularly rich this time of year." She walked out of the office, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the marble floor. She didn't look like a woman who had just lost everything. She looked like a woman who had just cleared the board for a new game. But Richard didn't see that. He was already in the elevator, texting Amelia. "Done. She's gone. Champagne is on ice." He had no idea that the signature on that paper wasn't an ending. It was a fuse. 6 months had passed since the divorce was finalized, and Richard Sterling was flying closer to the sun than ever before. His firm, Sterling Capital, had just posted record quarterly profits. He was featured on the cover of Forbes under the headline, "The Midas Touch: How Richard Sterling Turns Distressed Assets into Gold." He had the penthouse on Park Avenue all to himself. Well, himself and Amelia, who had quickly filled Sarah's old walk-in closet with Louis Vuitton and Prada. Richard felt lighter. Sarah had been a dragging anchor, always worrying about ethics and sustainability and risk. Amelia didn't care about risk. She cared about the gala season and whether they were taking the helicopter or the limousine to the Hamptons. It was a Tuesday in November when Richard's assistant, a nervous young man named David, buzzed him. "Mr. Sterling, the acquisition files for the Omnicorp deal are ready, but there's a slight hiccup." Richard swiveled in his chair, looking out at the Empire State Building. "I don't do hiccups, David. I do solutions. What is it?" "The majority shareholder of Omnicorp," David stammered. "They aren't selling. They've blocked our hostile takeover bid." Richard frowned. Omnicorp was a mid-sized tech logistics firm. It was the missing piece he needed to build a monopoly in the shipping sector. He had spent months manipulating the stock price to drive it down, making it ripe for the picking. "Who is the shareholder?" Richard barked. "I thought the board was fragmented." "It was," David said, "but a private holding company bought up 51% of the voting stock this morning. a shell company called Aletheia Ventures. Aletheia, Richard scoffed. Greek for truth. How pretentiously boring. Find out who runs it. Offer them 20% above market value. Everyone has a price. Richard dismissed it. He had a lunch meeting at the Modern with a senator he was bribing, lobbying, for favorable tax regulations. As he walked out of his building, putting on his sunglasses, he saw a figure across the street. It was Sarah. She was coming out of a public library, carrying a stack of books. She was wearing a heavy, shapeless wool coat and a knitted scarf. She looked ordinary, defeated. Richard felt a surge of smug satisfaction. He checked the traffic, saw a gap, and jaywalked across the street, flanked by his 2 bodyguards. He wanted to see it up close. He wanted to see the poverty. "Sarah!" he called out. She froze. She turned slowly. Her face was pale, no makeup. "Richard," she said. She held the books tighter to her chest. "I see you're educating yourself," he sneered, nodding at the library. "How's the shack in Woodstock? Roof cave in yet?" "The roof is fine," she said quietly. "I'm managing." "Managing?" he laughed. "I'm sure. Look, I'm feeling generous today. I just closed a deal that will net me 8 figures. If you need a little extra for heating oil or cat food." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a $100 bill. It was the ultimate insult. He held it out like one would to a beggar. Sarah looked at the bill. Then she looked at his face. For a split second, Richard thought he saw a spark of amusement in her eyes, but it vanished so quickly he assumed it was a reflection of the streetlights. "Keep your money, Richard," she said. "You might need it." "I never need money, Sarah. I make it. That's the difference between us. You consume space. I create value." He stuffed the bill into the pocket of her coat. "Buy yourself a nice dinner. Or 10. He turned on his heel and walked away, feeling like a god. He didn't see Sarah take the bill out of her pocket. He didn't see her walk to the homeless man sitting on the corner of Fifth Avenue, a veteran named Joe, who everyone ignored. "Here, Joe," Sarah said, handing him the 100. The man in the suit dropped this. "Bless you, Mom," Joe rasped. "You're an angel." "Not an angel, Joe," Sarah smiled, and this time the smile was sharp, predatory. "Just an accountant." She pulled out her phone, not the old cracked iPhone she used around Richard, but a sleek, encrypted satellite phone she kept in the inner lining of her coat. She dialed a number. "Miss Bennett?" a voice answered instantly. It was a man's voice, crisp, British, and deferential. "Hello, Jeffrey," Sarah said, her voice transforming. The timidity was gone. The library mouse persona evaporated. In its place was a voice of absolute command. "I just ran into the target." "Did he suspect anything?" "He suspects he's the king of the world," Sarah said, hailing a yellow cab. "He has no idea the ground is already crumbling. What's the status on the Omnicorp acquisition?" "We have secured 51% as you instructed. Mr. Sterling's team sent an offer 10 minutes ago, 20% above market." "Reject it," Sarah said coolly as she slid into the cab. "Tell them Aletheia Ventures isn't interested in money. Tell them we want a meeting." "A meeting, Ma'am? With whom?" "With Richard Sterling. Alone. Tell him if he wants Omnicorp, he has to pitch his vision to the chairman of Aletheia in person. Friday night, the gala at the Met." "He thinks the chairman is a recluse billionaire from Zurich," Jeffrey noted. "Let him keep thinking that," Sarah said, watching the city blur past the window. "I want him to walk into that room feeling invincible. I want him to bring his mistress. I want the press there. Make sure the Wall Street Journal has a front row seat." "Understood. And Miss Bennett, your dress for the gala has arrived from Milan. The emerald velvet." Good, Sarah said. Richard always hated green. He said it didn't suit me. She hung up the phone. Richard thought she was struggling to heat a shack in Woodstock. In reality, she had never even slept there. The Woodstock cottage was currently housing a refugee family she was sponsoring. Sarah had been living in a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, running Alethea Ventures, a private equity firm she had quietly built over the last 10 years, using a small inheritance Richard knew nothing about, an inheritance from her grandmother, a woman who had been one of the first female traders on the floor of the NYSE in the 70s. Richard had been so busy listening to his own voice that he never asked Sarah what she did on her laptop during those long nights while he was working late with Amelia. He assumed she was looking at recipes or knitting patterns. She had been trading, and she hadn't just been trading stocks. She had been buying the debt of his competitors, and now she was buying him. But Richard was right about one thing. The divorce left her with nothing. It left her with nothing to lose. The invitation arrived on heavy cream-colored cardstock, the kind that costs more per sheet than most people spend on groceries for a week. The edges were gilded in real gold leaf, and the font was a stark, elegant serif that demanded attention. You are cordially invited to an exclusive evening at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, hosted by Alethea Ventures, regarding the future of Omnicorp. Richard Sterling held the card between his thumb and forefinger, studying it as if it were a coded map. He was sitting in his corner office, the late afternoon sun casting long, jagged shadows across the Persian rug. Alethea, he muttered, rolling the word around his mouth like a marble. It tasted foreign, pretentious, just the way he liked it. It's tonight, Richard. Amelia's voice cut through his reverie. She was standing in the doorway, posing slightly. She was always posing, Richard had noticed lately, as if an invisible camera were constantly trained on her. She wore a slip of a dress, something silver and backless that clung to her like a second skin. It was beautiful, undeniably, but it lacked substance. I know it's tonight, Richard snapped, tossing the invitation onto his desk. This chairman wants to meet before the gala starts, a private audience in the Temple of Dendor wing. High drama. These European billionaires love their theatrics. Do I look okay? Amelia asked, twirling a strand of blonde hair. I felt like the silver was more tech acquisition than the red Dior. Richard looked at her. He really looked at her. 6 months ago, her pouty lips and vacuous questions had seemed charming, a refreshing break from Sarah's intense conversations about market volatility or moral responsibility. Now it was just exhausting. He felt like he was babysitting a very expensive doll. You look fine, Amelia. Just try not to talk too much tonight. The chairman is likely old, conservative, and serious. Just smile and drink the champagne. Amelia's face fell, a crack in the porcelain perfection. You don't have to be mean. I'm just trying to support you. Support is being ready on time, Richard grunted, checking his emails. We leave in 20 minutes. Across the city, in a brownstone that Richard didn't know existed, the atmosphere was entirely different. There was no frantic rushing, no insecurity. Sarah stood in the center of her dressing room. The walls were lined with books, not shoes. A single garment bag hung from the hook on the door. Geoffrey, her trusted advisor and right-hand man, stood by the window, checking a tablet. The press is briefed, Miss Bennet, Geoffrey said, his British accent calm and grounding. They believe the chairman of Alethea is making his first public appearance. Rumors are swirling that it's a reclusive tech mogul from Silicon Valley or perhaps a Saudi prince. Let them rumor, Sarah said softly. She reached for the zipper of the garment bag. Confusion is a powerful weapon, Geoffrey. It makes people sloppy. Richard hates confusion. He needs to label everything to control it. She unzipped the bag. Inside hung the dress. It was emerald green velvet, a deep, rich shade that looked almost black in the dim light. It was structured, with a high neck and long sleeves, but the back plunged dangerously low. It wasn't a dress for a trophy wife. It was a dress for a queen regent. It was regal, imposing, and undeniably sharp. Sarah touched the fabric. Richard had forbidden her from wearing green. "It makes you look sallow," he used to say. "Stick to neutrals. Be invisible." She stripped off her robe and stepped into the gown. It fit perfectly, tailored to the millimeter. As she pulled it up, she felt the transformation taking hold. The Sarah who clipped coupons and apologized for taking up space was gone. She sat at her vanity. She didn't apply the soft, barely there makeup Richard had preferred. She applied a bold, blood-red lip. She lined her eyes with sharp, winged kohl. She swept her hair up into an intricate, architectural chignon, securing it with a diamond pin that had belonged to her grandmother, the only asset she had hidden from Richard's lawyers. She looked in the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the wife who had been discarded. She was the architect of her own resurrection. "The car is waiting, ma'am," Geoffrey said, checking his pocket watch. "A Rolls-Royce Phantom, as requested. Tinted windows." Sarah stood up. She picked up a small black clutch. Inside was a single document, the contract for the transfer of Omnicorp, ready for signature. "Tell me, Geoffrey," Sarah said, walking toward the stairs, the velvet train of her dress hissing softly against the floorboards. "Do you believe in ghosts?" Geoffrey smiled, a dry, thin expression. "I believe that some people are haunted by their mistakes, Miss Bennet." "Tonight," Sarah said, her green eyes flashing, "Richard Sterling is going to meet his ghost." The Metropolitan Museum of Art was transformed. The Great Hall was awash in amber light, immense floral arrangements of white orchids towering over the guests. The air buzzed with the low hum of power, the specific frequency of billionaires, senators, and celebrities mingling. Richard Sterling stepped out of his limousine, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi erupting like a lightning storm. He adjusted his tuxedo jacket, flashing his trademark shark-like grin. He thrived on this. This was his oxygen. He placed a hand on Amelia's lower back, guiding her up the iconic steps. She beamed at the cameras, soaking in the attention, but Richard was already scanning the crowd, looking for usefulness. He saw the CEO of Goldman Sachs and gave a curt nod. He ignored a junior senator who had lost his committee seat. "Richard, darling," a voice called out. It was Beatrice van der Waal, a society matriarch who controlled half the charity boards in the city. Richard smiled, stepping forward. "Beatrice, you look radiant." Beatrice offered her cheek, but didn't look at Amelia. Her eyes darted around Richard. "I heard a rumor, Richard, about Alethea Ventures. They say they've bought the controlling stake in that shipping company you were drooling over." Richard's smile tightened at the edges. "It's a negotiation, Beatrice. Nothing is finalized." "Well," Beatrice lowered her voice, leaning in behind her fan. "Be careful. I heard the head of Alethea is ruthless. They say he bankrupted a firm in London just for sport last year." "I can handle ruthlessness," Richard said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I invented it." He steered Amelia away, his grip on her arm slightly too tight. "You're hurting me," she whispered. "Walk faster," he hissed. "We have a meeting. I want to get this over with so I can enjoy my drink." They navigated through the Egyptian wing, passing ancient sarcophagi and stone statues of forgotten kings. The crowd thinned out as they approached the Temple of Denda. The massive room, with its Egyptian temple surrounded by a reflective pool and a wall of glass looking out onto Central Park, was cordoned off. A large man in a black suit with an earpiece stood at the velvet rope. "Name?" the guard asked, his voice like gravel. "Richard Sterling," Richard said, straightening his cuffs. "And guest? I have an appointment with the chairman." The guard checked a list on a tablet. He didn't smile. He didn't look impressed. He simply unhooked the rope. "The chairman is waiting on the north balcony. You are to go up alone." "She comes with me," Richard said, gesturing to Amelia. "The invitation specified you," the guard said, blocking Amelia's path. "It's fine, Richard," Amelia said, looking nervous. The size of the room and the silence were intimidating her. I'll wait by the bar. I need a cocktail anyway." Richard rolled his eyes. "Fine. Give me 10 minutes. Then we celebrate." He walked past the guard, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The Temple of Denda was breathtaking, lit by dramatic uplights that cast long, eerie shadows against the sandstone. But Richard didn't care about art. He cared about the leverage. He walked toward the stairs leading to the private balcony that overlooked the temple. He rehearsed his pitch in his head. Mutual benefit. Synergy. I have the infrastructure. You have the stock. Let's merge. He reached the top of the stairs. The balcony was empty, save for a single figure standing by the railing, looking out at the temple below. The figure was facing away from him. It was a woman. Richard paused. He had expected an old man, a Swiss banker, a tech bro in a hoodie. This was a woman in an emerald green velvet gown that hugged a silhouette he found vaguely, disturbingly familiar. Her hair was up in an elaborate chignon. The scent in the air wasn't cologne. It was a subtle mix of jasmine and rain. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice booming slightly in the vast space. "I'm looking for the chairman of Aletheia Ventures." The woman didn't turn. She stood perfectly still, her hand resting on the stone railing. "You found the chairwoman," she said. The voice. It hit Richard like a physical blow to the chest. It was lower, huskier, colder than he remembered. But the cadence was unmistakable. He stopped walking. His breath hitched in his throat. His brain frantically tried to reject the data it was receiving. Impossible. She's in Woodstock. She's poor. She's nothing. "I beg your pardon," Richard stammered, his confidence leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. "I think there's been a mistake. I'm here to meet a serious investor, not whoever you are." "There is no mistake, Richard," the woman said. Slowly, deliberately, she turned around. The movement was graceful, terrifyingly controlled. The emerald velvet caught the light. The diamond pin in her hair sparked. And then there was the face. It was Sarah. But it wasn't the Sarah he knew. The Sarah he knew looked down when she spoke. The Sarah he knew wore beige cardigans and worried about the electric bill. The Sarah he knew had soft, pleading eyes. This woman had eyes of flint. Her chin was high. Her red lips were curved into a smile that contained zero warmth and infinite danger. Richard felt his knees lock. The room seemed to tilt. The grand silence of the museum felt suddenly like a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of his lungs. "Sarah," he whispered. The word came out as a question, weak and pathetic. "Hello, Richard," she said. She didn't move toward him. She held her ground, a queen on her chessboard. "You're late. I expected you 3 minutes ago." "What? What are you doing here?" Richard laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Did you crash the party? Did you get a job here? Catering? Sarah, you can't be here. Security will throw you out. This area is reserved for the owners of Aletheia." "I know," Sarah said, taking a slow step forward, the heels of her shoes clicking sharply. "I authorized the reservation." "Stop it," Richard snapped, his face flushing red. "Stop this game, it's embarrassing. You're embarrassing yourself. Look, I don't know who you slept with to get that dress, but you need to leave before my business partners arrive." "Your business partners aren't coming, Richard," Sarah said calmly. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a business card. It was heavy, black, with gold lettering. She flicked it toward him. It fluttered through the air and landed at his feet. Richard looked down. "Aletheia Ventures, Sarah Bennett, founder and chairwoman." He stared at the card. He looked back at her. The dots were refusing to connect, because connecting them meant his entire reality was a lie. "You," Richard stammered. "You don't have money. I checked. I left you with nothing. You were begging for the cottage." "I didn't beg for the cottage, Richard," Sarah corrected him, her voice cool and smooth like liquid nitrogen. "I demanded what was mine, just like I demanded my maiden name. And as for money, you're right. Sarah Sterling had nothing. But Sarah Bennett? She's been busy." She walked to a small table on the balcony where a bottle of Cristal was chilling. She poured herself a glass, ignoring him. "You were always so busy looking at the mirror, Richard, that you never looked at the books," she said, taking a sip. "You never asked where your initial seed money really came from 12 years ago, did you? You thought it was your charm. It was my grandmother's trust." "That's a lie," Richard rasped. "And you never asked who was buying up the bad debt you were shedding last year," Sarah continued, her eyes locking onto his. "You thought you were a genius for clearing your balance sheet. In reality, you were selling your leverage to me. I own your debt, Richard. I own your loans. And as of this morning, I own 51% of Omnicorp." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping horror. You're the holdout?" "I am the wall you hit," Sarah said, "and I'm the freeze that's about to kill your deal." Below them, in the main hall, the chatter of the party continued, oblivious. But up on the balcony, in the shadow of the ancient temple, Richard Sterling was watching his life disintegrate. "Why?" he whispered. "Why go to all this trouble? If you had money, why did you let me humiliate you in the divorce? Why did you take the beat-up Honda?" Sarah set the glass down. She walked up to him, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. She looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Because, Richard," she said softly, "I wanted to see who you really were when you thought no one was watching. I wanted to see if there was a single shred of humanity left in you." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "I found nothing," she said. "So now, I'm going to leave you with exactly that." The sound of applause erupted from the floor below. Someone was making a toast, but Richard didn't hear it. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heart and the sound of the trap snapping shut. The silence on the balcony was heavier than the stone pillars supporting the temple roof. Below them, the gala roared on, a sea of black ties and designer silk, laughter that sounded like breaking glass and the clinking of crystal. But up here, in the shadows of the Egyptian wing, time seemed to have curdled. Richard Sterling gripped the railing until his knuckles turned the color of old bone. He looked at the business card lying at his feet. Aletheia Ventures. He looked back at Sarah. She was sipping her champagne, her silhouette framed against the illuminated glass wall that looked out onto the dark expanse of Central Park. She didn't look like an ex-wife. She looked like an executioner who had already sharpened the blade and was now just waiting for the condemned man to stop crying. "You can't do this," Richard hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. He took a step toward her, his instinct to intimidate kicking in. It was a reflex that had served him well in boardrooms for 20 years. "You think you can play dress-up and scare me? I built Sterling Capital from the ground up. I have lawyers who eat people like you for breakfast." Sarah turned her head slowly. The movement was so dismissive it felt like a slap. "Your lawyers?" she asked, her voice low and amused. "You mean Arthur? Arthur is currently renegotiating his own contract. He seemed quite eager to avoid being disbarred for the hidden offshore accounts you had him set up in the Caymans. It's amazing what people will confess when the SEC starts asking the right questions." Richard froze. The blood drained from his face so fast he felt dizzy. You spoke to the SEC?" "I didn't have to," Sarah said, walking over to the railing and looking down at the party. "I simply bought the bank that held the mortgage on Arthur's beach house. We had a lovely chat about risk management. He decided that protecting you was a liability he could no longer afford." Richard felt the walls closing in. The air in the vast museum felt thin, insufficient. He tugged at his bow tie. "Sarah, listen. Let's take a breath." He tried to smile. It was a ghastly thing, a rictus of panic. He switched tactics. If intimidation didn't work, he would use charm. He would use the history they shared. "Look at us," he said, spreading his hands. "Fighting like this. It's ridiculous. We were partners once, remember? The Queen's apartment, the late nights. I know I was harsh during the divorce. I was under a lot of pressure. But we built something together. We can do it again." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a seductive whisper. "You have the capital. I have the expertise. Think about it, Sarah. Omnicorp. We could run it together. You and me. Like the old days. But better. We'd be unstoppable." Sarah looked at him. For a moment, her expression softened. Richard felt a surge of hope. He knew it. She was still the same soft-hearted woman who used to make him soup when he had the flu. She still loved him. This was all just a cry for attention. "Partners," Sarah repeated softly. "Yes," Richard urged, stepping into her personal space. "Partners. I can get rid of Amelia. She's a distraction, a fling. She means nothing. You're the one who knows me, Sarah. You're the one who matters." Sarah smiled. It was a beautiful smile. And then she laughed. It wasn't a bitter laugh. It was a dry, hollow sound, devoid of any humor. "You really are a cliché, Richard," she said, her eyes turning to ice. "You think you can rewrite history because you're scared of the future. But you're forgetting one thing." She set her champagne glass down on the stone ledge with a sharp clink. "I didn't build Sterling Capital with you," she said, her voice hardening into steel. "I built it for you. I did the forensic accounting that saved you from the audit in 2015. I wrote the risk algorithms you took credit for in 2018. I was the foundation. And when you tore down the house to build a bachelor pad, you forgot that the foundation owns the dirt." She reached into her clutch and pulled out a folded document. "This isn't a merger offer, Richard," she said, holding it out. "This is a debt call." Richard took the paper. His hands were shaking so badly the paper rattled. He scanned the legal jargon. Purchase of debt obligations, Sterling Capital, default provisions, immediate repayment. "You bought my loans," he whispered. "The bridge loans for the tech expansion, the liquidity lines. All of them," Sarah confirmed. $300 million in high-interest debt. and since you violated the covenants by leveraging your personal assets to buy that penthouse you're so fond of, I'm calling the notes due. Tonight. I don't have $300 million in cash, Richard shouted, his voice cracking. My liquidity is tied up in the Omnicorp bid. If you call this debt, I'm insolvent. I'll lose everything. The firm, the penthouse, my reputation. Yes, Sarah said simply. That is the math. Why? Richard grabbed her arm. Why are you doing this? Is this about the $50,000? I'll give it back. I'll give you $5 million. 10. Sarah looked at his hand on her arm. She didn't pull away. She just looked at it until he released her, terrified by the coldness radiating from her. It's not about the money, Richard. It never was. It's about the balance sheet. She stepped back, smoothing the velvet of her dress. You treated people like assets to be acquired and liabilities to be discarded, she said. You discarded me because you thought I had depreciated. You thought I had no value left. But you forgot the most basic rule of investing. Past performance is not indicative of future results. She checked her watch, a slender platinum piece that cost more than Richard's car. The gala presentation starts in 5 minutes. I'm the keynote speaker. I have an announcement to make regarding the future of Alethea Ventures and its new subsidiary, Sterling Capital. No, Richard gasped. You can't. You can't announce a hostile takeover at a charity gala. It's suicide. It's not a hostile takeover, Sarah said, walking toward the stairs. It's a foreclosure. She paused at the top of the steps and looked back at him. He looked small, broken, a man in a tuxedo that suddenly seemed too big for him. You have 2 choices, Richard. You can stay up here in the dark and hide, or you can come downstairs, smile for the cameras, and watch me freeze the room. If you come down, I might let you keep the Hamptons house. For old times' sake. She didn't wait for an answer. She descended the stairs, her emerald dress flowing behind her like dark water. Richard stood alone on the balcony, the sound of his own pulse deafening in his ears. He looked at the debt call in his hand. He looked at the drop to the stone floor below. He straightened his tie. He was Richard Sterling. He would not hide. He would go down there, and he would find a way to spin this. He always did. He took a deep breath, swallowed his terror, and followed her into the light. The great hall of the Met was a kaleidoscope of flashbulbs and diamonds. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the murmur of 1,000 guarded conversations. Amelia was waiting at the bottom of the stairs near the Temple of Denda. She had finished 2 martinis in Richard's absence and was feeling impatient. When she saw him descending, she brightened, striking a pose for a nearby photographer. But then she saw his face. Richard looked like he had seen a ghost. His skin was grey, a sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead, despite the cool air. His eyes were darting around the room wildly. "Richard," Amelia asked, stepping forward and grabbing his arm. "What happened? You look terrible. Did the chairman not like the pitch?" Richard didn't look at her. He was looking past her, tracking a figure in emerald green, moving through the crowd like a shark parting a school of fish. "Shut up, Amelia," Richard muttered, his voice hoarse. "Excuse me?" Amelia recoiled, her face flushing. "I have been standing here for 20 minutes while you—" "I said shut up!" Richard snapped, loud enough that a few people nearby turned to look. Beatrice Vanderwall raised an eyebrow from behind her champagne flute. Amelia's mouth snapped shut. Tears pricked her eyes, but Richard was already moving, pulling her along in his wake. He was following the green dress. He had to stop her. He had to talk to her before she got to the microphone. The room began to hush. The lights dimmed, focusing on a raised podium in front of the temple. The museum director, a tall man with silver hair, stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice echoing through the vast hall. "Distinguished guests, tonight we are honored to celebrate the largest single donation in the history of the Metropolitan Museum's modern art wing." Applause rippled through the room. Richard pushed through the crowd, ignoring the glares of people he shoved aside. "This donation," the director continued, "comes from a firm that has rapidly become a titan of ethical investing, Alethea Ventures." More applause. Whispers broke out. "Who is it? Who runs Alethea?" "And here to present the vision for the future," the director gestured to the side of the stage, "please welcome the chairwoman of Alethea Ventures, Ms. Sarah Bennett." The name hung in the air for a split second before the applause started. Richard froze. He was 10 feet away from the stage. Amelia, standing next to him, frowned. "Sarah Bennett, wasn't that your ex-wife's maiden name?" Richard didn't answer. He couldn't breathe. Sarah walked onto the stage. If she had looked regal on the balcony, she looked imperial now. The stage lights caught the emerald velvet, making her glow. She stood tall, her posture perfect, her face serene and terrifyingly confident. She looked out at the sea of faces, faces of men who had ignored her at parties for years, faces of women who had pitied her dowdy clothes. She adjusted the microphone. She didn't smile. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was clear, calm, and commanded absolute silence. "For a long time," Sarah began, her eyes scanning the front row, landing briefly on the CEO of Goldman Sachs, then the mayor, "I believed that value was something you had to shout to prove. I thought power was about noise, about aggression." She paused. The room was deadly silent. "But I have learned that true power is quiet," she continued. "It is the ability to see what others miss. It is the patience to wait until the pieces align." Richard felt like he was drowning. He saw the journalists in the press pit, scribbling furiously. "Who is she? Is that Sterling's ex?" "Tonight," Sarah said, "Alethea Ventures is announcing the acquisition of Omnicorp." A gasp went through the room. That was the deal of the decade. "However," Sarah raised a hand, silencing the murmur, "we are not acquiring it for profit alone. We are acquiring it to restructure it, to dismantle the toxic debt that has plagued the sector." She looked directly at where Richard was standing. The spotlight seemed to follow her gaze, and for a terrifying moment, Richard felt exposed, stripped naked before the elite of New York. "To that end," Sarah said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming intimate and lethal, "Alethea Ventures has also acquired the outstanding debt obligations of Sterling Capital." The room erupted. It wasn't polite applause this time. It was shock, a collective intake of breath that sucked the air out of the room. Heads whipped around, eyes locked onto Richard. He stood there, frozen, his hand still gripping Amelia's arm so hard she was wincing. "Richard," Amelia whispered, her voice trembling. "What is she saying?" "Richard, everyone is looking at us," Sarah continued, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "We have found that the current leadership of Sterling Capital lacks the necessary vision for the future. As the primary creditor, we are exercising our right to restructure the board, effective immediately." She paused for effect. "We are freezing all assets of Sterling Capital, pending a forensic audit." Freezing. The word hung there. "He thought divorce left me with nothing," Sarah said. And this time she broke the fourth wall, looking not at the crowd, but directly into the camera lens that was broadcasting the event live. "But he forgot that when you strip everything away, what remains is the truth. And the truth is, I was never the liability, Richard. I was the architect." She stepped back from the microphone. For 3 seconds, There was absolute silence. The kind of silence that happens after a car crash, before the screaming starts. Then, chaos. Reporters began shouting questions. Flashbulbs went off like strobe lights, blinding Richard. "Mr. Sterling, is it true? Is Sterling Capital insolvent? Mr. Sterling, comment on the hostile takeover by your ex-wife." Richard stumbled back. He felt nauseous. He turned to run, to get away from the lights, but the crowd had turned into a wall. The same people who had shaken his hand 10 minutes ago were now stepping back, creating a perimeter of isolation around him. He was toxic. Amelia looked at him. She looked at the reporters. Then she looked at Sarah, standing on the stage like a goddess of vengeance. Amelia did the calculation. She was young, but she wasn't stupid. She pulled her arm out of Richard's grip. "Amelia," Richard pleaded, reaching for her. "We need to go. Now." "No," Amelia said, her voice loud enough for the nearby reporters to hear. "I think you need to go, Richard. I have nothing to do with this fraud." She stepped away from him, dissolving into the crowd, leaving him completely alone in the center of the spotlight. Richard looked up at the stage one last time. Sarah was watching him. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the same nod she used to give him when he found his keys in the morning, a nod that said, "I handled it." She turned and walked off the stage, leaving Richard Sterling standing in the wreckage of the life he thought he owned, while the room around him burned with the news of her name. The morning sun over Manhattan didn't look like opportunity to Richard Sterling anymore. It looked like a harsh interrogation lamp, exposing every crack in his life. Less than 12 hours after the gala, the freeze Sarah had promised had set in with terrifying speed. Richard stood in the lobby of the Sterling Capitol building, the place he had built, the place that bore his name in chrome letters above the reception desk. He couldn't get past the turnstiles. His access card flashed red. "Access denied." "David!" Richard shouted, spotting his assistant scurrying across the lobby with a box of personal belongings. "David, get security to fix this card." David stopped. He looked at Richard, then at the 2 security guards standing ominously close to the elevators. David didn't look nervous anymore. He looked relieved. "I can't do that, Mr. Sterling," David said, clutching his box. "The new board issued a directive at 6 a.m. All former executive access is revoked pending the audit. I've just been let go. You're being sued by the shareholders." "The new board?" Richard whispered. "Alethea Ventures," David said. "They own the building now." He walked out the revolving doors, not looking back. Richard checked his phone. He had 17 missed calls from Amelia, all texts asking about the lease on the apartment. He tried to open his banking app. Account frozen. He tried his credit cards. Declined. He was standing in a $5,000 tuxedo he had slept in, with a dead phone and a wallet full of useless plastic. A courier bike pulled up to the curb. A messenger in a helmet walked into the lobby, scanning the room. "Richard Sterling," the messenger called out. Richard stepped forward, a flicker of hope igniting. Maybe it was a lawyer. Maybe it was a lifeline. "Sign here," the messenger said, handing him a thick manila envelope. Richard scribbled his signature with a shaking hand. He tore the envelope open right there in the lobby, under the pitying gaze of the security guards. Inside was a single set of keys. Old brass keys. And a deed. It was the deed to the property in Woodstock, the cottage with the leaking roof, the uninhabitable shack he had mocked Sarah for wanting. Attached to the deed was a handwritten note on Alethea stationery. "Richard, as the majority stakeholder of Sterling Capital, I have liquidated your personal assets to cover the firm's outstanding liabilities. The penthouse, the Hamptons estate, and the cars have been seized by the bank. However, per our divorce agreement, I am honoring the division of assets. You insisted that the worthless assets be discarded. I have decided to gift you the Woodstock property. It's fully paid off. It has charm. I left a bus ticket to upstate in the envelope. It leaves Port Authority at noon. P.S. I fixed the roof. You're welcome. Sarah Bennett. Richard stared at the keys. The weight of them felt heavy in his palm. The irony was a physical blow. The only roof he had left over his head was the one she had fixed. The only asset he owned was the one he had tried to throw away. He looked out the window. It started to rain. Uptown, in the penthouse office of Alethea Ventures, Sarah Bennett stood by the window. She wasn't watching the rain, she was watching the ticker tape on her screen. Omnicorp stock up 15%. The transition is complete, Miss Bennett, Jeffrey said, placing a cup of tea on her desk. Security confirms Mr. Sterling has vacated the premises. The press is calling him the Icarus of Wall Street. Sarah turned away from the window. She didn't feel a surge of malicious joy. She didn't feel the need to laugh or celebrate. She just felt clean. The ledger was balanced. The debt was paid. Let the press talk, Sarah said, picking up her tea. We have work to do. The logistics division needs a complete overhaul. And I want to set up that scholarship fund for women in finance by Monday. Of course, ma'am, Jeffrey said. He paused at the door. If I may ask, did you really fix the roof for him? Sarah smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had walked through fire and come out carrying the torch. I did, Jeffrey, she said softly. Everyone deserves a shelter, even the people who try to tear yours down. Besides, I needed him to know that even my charity is better than his best day. Jeffrey chuckled and closed the door. Sarah sat down at the head of the massive oak table. She opened a fresh notebook. She wrote her name at the top of the page. Sarah Bennett. She wasn't Richard Sterling's ex-wife anymore. She wasn't the invisible woman in the beige cardigan. She was the storm that had cleared the air. And as she looked at the blank page, she knew that this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the first chapter. And that is how Richard Sterling learned the hardest lesson of his life. He thought that stripping Sarah of her title and her money would leave her with nothing. He forgot that a title is just a word, and money is just paper. The true value was in the woman herself, her intelligence, her resilience, and her patience. Richard chased the appearance of power and ended up with a set of keys to a broken cottage. Sarah chased the truth, and she ended up owning the skyline. It serves as a powerful reminder to us all. Be careful who you underestimate. The person holding the door for you today might be the one buying the building tomorrow. And never ever assume that silence means weakness. Sometimes silence is just the sound of someone loading the cannon. Wow, what a journey for Sarah Bennett. If that final twist gave you chills, hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel. What do you think? Did Richard deserve what he got, or was Sarah too harsh? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've ever been underestimated and came out on top, share your story. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story about justice, karma, and the twists of real life. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.